has been such a pleasure to do these events and speak to you who are willing to learn and willing to partake in these very ever-present discussions. I would like to first say thank you to everyone who's attending. For some of the folks on the East Coast, thank you so much for making the time. And for us on the West Coast, I know this is at the end of our day. So again, thank you for willing to hang in there for a couple more hours of enriched discussion. I'd like to first start by saying that we have some really dynamic speakers joining us today. It's going to start with Dr. Matt Harris, who happens to be on the East Coast, so we're really appreciating him making time for us here on the West Coast. And also followed by Dr. Helen Hsu, and then by Dr. Natalie Jones. And I'll give a brief intro of each person as we get closer to their intro. But just a couple of things that I want to address. As we're talking about becoming stronger allies, I want everyone to kind of think about the fact that we might be talking about some very hard-hitting topics for some. For others, you might be absolutely fine just having these conversations. But we like to make sure that everyone is aware of some of the triggers that can, not aware, but we ask that you be aware of some of the things that might be triggering for you. So take a moment, think about what some of your triggers are. We highly encourage that all the participants take a moment to participate in the chat room. Often a lot of dialogues around race or culture or racism or any of the isms take place in small groups or closed off sessions. And we want to actually encourage people to kind of speak their truths and speak their thoughts and really begin a dialogue. And I think that's part of allyship, is being able to ask questions, be curious. So with that, we have a frame for today's discussion if you're going to participate in the chat. We really want people to speak honestly, but we also want people to be supportive. So in the spirit of being honest and supportive, we are using the ouch, oops kind of model. If someone says something that reflects a concern or you feel hurt by it, we'd like for you to speak to it in the chat by writing ouch. Ouch, X, Y, and Z was something that I felt hurt by, or I was maybe triggered by. If someone says something that they realize later was maybe not the best way to frame a thought, we can use the oops model as well, so that we can actually facilitate dialogues that are supportive and open up conversation versus shutting them down. So in that same process, as we're having this discussion, it's really important to think about where you are in your own identity development as it relates to discussing just racial and identity development. There are so many theorists out there that have written about this topic for lots of different cultural backgrounds, from William Cross's Black American racial identity model, or Poston's biracial model, as well as Helm's white racial identity model. There is even, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Nadal's model for Filipino-American racial identity development, and Maria Root, her resolutions of biracial identity model. So there are different models that I think each of us have, if not already, learned about, but can learn about. I believe there is access to this as a resource, which will be listed in the chat. And I think it's really important to think about where we are in our own identity. As we've joked, everyone likes to think they've made it to the last step, but sometimes we haven't quite made it there yet. So let's think about where we are. If we hear something that actually does trigger us, does it mean that we're not in that final stage? And if so, what could that mean in terms of growing and developing and having these really challenging conversations to get to that final stage? Growth doesn't come without a little bit of a challenge. So I want to make sure that we are thinking about where we are as we engage in these dialogues. So with that said, some of the terms that you might hear us discussing are terms such as white privilege, whitewashing. We will be discussing all lives matter versus Black lives matter. So there's going to be a lot of things to discuss, but we're definitely wanting to come into this discussion with open minds, open hearts, and see where we come out on the end of it. So again, without further ado, I am going to be introducing you to Dr. Matt Harris, and I will have him pop in. I apologize. I don't have his bio in front of me, but I do know Dr. Harris is an amazing neuropsychologist who does great work for a nonprofit in NYC.
North Carolina.
North Carolina. I knew there was an N and a C in there. So thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Doing all right. Thank you.
Of course.
Excited to talk about these things.
I am glad, because I think that this is going to be such a rich discussion, and who better to have this discussion with than you?
A straight white male is who everybody needs to hear from right now. No, I'm hoping that we can get some good conversation going. As far as introducing myself, I was nervous about doing this talk. As excited as I am, I'm, like my joke alluded to, this isn't necessarily the time that we need a straight white male telling other people how to be helpful or what I can do to help them as an ally. But like you had talked about, everyone's in a different stage of realizing their own identity. And I'm not at the last step. But I do think I know enough of these things to talk about them, and you can, hopefully it's helpful to everybody to hear all these different points of view and hear where different people are at, including a straight white male with loads of privilege who is working on identifying that and trying to reach the goal of becoming an ally. So,
well, awesome. Thank you. And I think you would probably agree that like identity is very similar to our practices in terms of mental health. It's, you know, it's always ever present. It's always something that we can grow in, and it's always ever changing. So we don't necessarily stay in a phase. We cycle through many of them. But as you pointed out, as a white male of privilege who's doing the work, I'm wondering if you can start with speaking to what white privilege or privilege means to you.
Sure. It's a pretty broad idea of what is privilege. And I guess I'll speak a little more to the white privilege part, since that's a little more, although there's a lot of other types of privileges out there, including ones that I have. It starts with this idea of these unseen, unconscious advantages that people have. The problem with that idea was that it's easier to write it off that way. If you say, oh, it's just these mild, minor things that we don't see, some little ways that I, as a white person, have some advantage that I might not have realized in the moment. So I can't be blamed for that. And maybe it didn't play a big role because it's unseen. So I've taken that definition in my head and kind of added to it the whole historic context and the systemic context that it's ever present. It's not just unseen and unconscious all the time. There are conscious acts of taking advantage of your privilege or reinforcing privilege that happen all the time. And so it's not just this one idea. It's all these things put together is what white privilege means to me. All these infinite ways that I am getting privilege in every situation, whether it's easy to identify its direct role or not.
I think that's such a great point. The seen versus unseen piece, I think, is so important. And I think of a couple of examples of how white privilege might be seen versus unseen. Like, for example, being pulled over or not. And I'm wondering if you could speak to some examples of how white privilege may have manifest for you versus for other people of color.
Sure. It's hard. And before I dodge that question, I'm not dodging it, but it's hard to come up with specific examples because, like I said, sometimes you don't always know. And it's this idea that the privilege is this ever-present thing always happening. If you look at the statistics of how many people end up in bad altercations when being pulled over, how many people are in this situation, And people always try to take out one example and go, well, that person was talking back to the police, and that person wasn't, and that person was doing this. And this one scenario, I can try and invent how privilege wasn't playing a role or was. Mm-hmm. Or I even see in the other direction all these Facebook memes where it's like, this white person said this, that's the definition of white privilege. I'm like, that's not the definition of white privilege. That's a very potential situation where white privilege was playing a role, but it's not that white privilege is this one identifiable thing in this one situation. So that's why I was dodging the snares a little bit, because there's so many.
Well, I don't think you're dodging it. I think maybe you're prefacing it, right?
So if I went through my life, I could come up with billions of all the times that I was pulled over and it didn't have terrible things happen to me. All the times that I didn't realize when somebody liked me, and part of them liking me was some subconscious thing about me being white and having power and privilege. Times that I realized and times that I thought were my own accomplishments, where I go, yeah, I killed that interview. And they're going, as a straight white male coming across a certain way, you killed that interview. The interview was killed, but not necessarily by me killing it.
Well, I think you're speaking to something too, is that, well, one, how unconscious this can be, and the accomplishments that individuals make or experience, and how much of it is related to their privilege versus how much it being related to their skill. And I'm wondering about where you are now. Do you feel that your accomplishments have been part and parcel related to white privilege, or do you feel like you've fairly earned your accomplishments?
Good question. So this is the eternal struggle, right? And this is what especially white people with privilege need to work on acknowledging. So yes, I acknowledge that there was a huge role of white privilege in all of my accomplishments and my successes. It's easy for me to just say that. For some people, it's very hard for them to say that, but you can say it. But do you truly integrate that and feel that? Because I can say, oh yeah, I understand how big of a role white privilege plays. No, I did not earn everything I have at all. I had a massive advantage. That's the whole point of the privilege. But there's always this dissonance with, but I'm awesome. I worked my butt off. I'm smart. I killed that interview. And you have to be able to accept this idea that privilege played a huge role. There's a reason that people who are born into a certain socioeconomic status stay there, no matter how much work you do. I might be spoiler alerting some discussion about bootstrapping myths, but you can look at that and say, okay, well, it's playing a huge role. And for me to not get defensive and say, oh, does that mean that I'm not awesome? Does that mean that I didn't earn everything? No, I didn't earn 100% everything I got. But did I work hard? Yes. Do I deserve some basic success in my life? Yes. But it's realizing that I was handed a lot of things that are through a system of inequity at the expense of people of color especially, but other disenfranchised groups, that was given to me unfairly, that I benefited from, and in benefiting from it, I have perpetuated that. So I know it's a roundabout way of answering your question, but that's the eternal struggle, is to say, how do I reconcile that I'm awesome with the very real understanding that I do acknowledge and believe that I earned, what, 5% of what I got? I don't know what percent. That's probably controversial, but
well, I don't think there's ever really a very clear line, but I do hear you're saying it's a both and situation, and both that you have benefited from privilege, but you've also worked hard. And as someone who has worked with you, I do know that you work hard. But you are also alluding to the fact that sometimes there are situations where having privilege is advantageous for you, and that you're reconciling that in your own mind. And you brought up the bootstrapping myth. So I'm wondering if you can speak to what that is and how it might further systems of privilege.
Sure. And again, I'm no expert on this, so I'm just going to tell you my understanding. My understanding of the bootstrapping myth is it's this idea that's perpetuated by American individualism ideals, especially the idea that if anyone works hard enough, they can make it. You can, quote, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, wherever that phrase actually came from. But that if you have enough fortitude, stick-to-itiveness, grit, there's a recent book that came out, trying to moral strength, especially historically, if you're a good person and you believe in God, the correct God in the right way, then, and you work really hard, then you can succeed. The numbers don't support this. As like I said, the vast majority of people who are born into a certain rung stay there, despite working really, really hard, despite being really intelligent. There's some obvious counter to this myth that just anyone can do it. So in my understanding, that's why it's a myth, and there's likely the function of the myth is to keep these systems of power in place, right? To keep all these white CEOs happy and say, oh, well, we earned it. We worked really hard. I didn't get this on the backs of other people or by basically taking advantage of an oppressive system, because there's that one black CEO. If the rest of the people could just stop complaining and work as hard as that one did, then they could get successful too. Stop whining about oppression is basically the function of that. And so,
yeah, I think that you're spot on in terms of this perception that if you just keep working harder, it's going to help you advance. And not to say that people shouldn't work hard, but your level of effort is not going to equate to the same outcome as someone who has privilege because of the privilege. So just kind of thinking of that, you know, how you spoke to that acknowledgement, I'm also wondering if you can speak to what white fragility might mean for you.
Sure. And that ties in perfectly. So white fragility, it's this term, it's in the Oxford Dictionary, actually. Discomfort, I'm going to define it for you because that's just the nerdy thing to do. And then I'm going to tell you what it means to me. But what it means to Oxford is discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. So Robin DiAngelo has this book, White Fragility. Some of that's controversial, but the basic idea behind it was to bring about this idea of white fragility, which you could call it white defensiveness, but kind of the whole point is that it's a little more than that. This is a very specific scenario. Yes, other non-white people can be defensive too. Humans get defensive, but this is about, we're talking about a very specific disenfranchised group and a very specific privileged group that's taking advantage of that. And when you challenge their power or challenge the basis of their power, the inequality that's going on, they become very defensive. So that's my understanding of it. And that, of course, we all have this. Everyone has defensiveness when something about theirs is challenged, but especially white people don't want to believe that the bootstrapping myth is actually a myth. And even people who have been trying to be an ally and explore these issues around themselves, like myself, I work on that. There's some there. It's always happened. There's that tiny voice in the head that goes, what about this? What about that? What about this? Oh, are they overdoing it with this case? There's one argument, there's one Facebook meme or whatever it is. And that's the fragility. That's some defensiveness acting up and saying, well, why am I nitpicking this one scenario? I'm picking this nit because I am defensive. There's some little voice in me not wanting to believe that.
Well, I'm glad that you can speak to how the voices come in and say, hey, what about this? Or, you know, and then actually challenging that. And it sounds like, to me, that is part of developing the allyship. So I'm wondering what, and I'm going to kind of move around here, what you feel the price would be that you're willing to pay to become an ally. And even with that, I'm curious what you feel like an ally is and what an ally does.
Yeah, and that's a tough question to answer because there's so much that could mean, right? What an ally is varies by circumstance. What a price you're willing to pay is a question we should all ask ourselves. If you want to be an ally, say, what price am I willing to pay? And once you realize that, including your own limitations in what you're willing to pay, you can then take steps forward. So in the real world that we live in right now, what is the price necessary to be an ally? And what does showing allyship or being an ally mean in this scenario? It would be different in a different context, right?
Right.
And I don't know the answer to my own limits of what I'm willing to pay, but it starts with something we've already talked about, which is being willing to be uncomfortable, being willing to admit that I might not have earned everything that I have, that so many scenarios that I think I killed that interview. The system helped me kill that interview. Things like that, and encountering my own defensiveness when it comes to that and saying, wow, it feels really weird to think that I'm awesome and also that I didn't deserve everything. Not that I don't deserve it, but that I didn't, quote unquote, earn everything the way I think I did, that the system played a role. So that's the first step, is being willing to be uncomfortable, which is hard for a lot of people. You start to feel uncomfortable and your brain just shuts down, goes, no, this is terrible. Let me make up some kind of conspiracy of why none of this is real, or some good explanation why I shouldn't have to feel this way.
Well, I'm wondering if you might, in the time we have, be able to give an example of what being an ally would look like in your own work as a neuropsychologist, like knowing how you would or when you would speak up in a situation.
Sure. And that's perfect, because when I was thinking of these steps of what prices have I tried to pay or thought I had to pay or encountered, the first is discomfort. The second, which is harder for me, is the speaking up, especially in front of people. This is a social price that especially white people can be scared to play, because you've got this sometimes unpopular opinion. Sometimes you're risking some social ostracizing and so on, depending on the scenario. Again, we can wait till there's a overwhelming movement like Black Lives Matter. This is very powerful, not overwhelming, but powerful movement that makes it more acceptable. And I can go back to my hometown of Santa Cruz, which is pretty progressive, and I'm taking much less risk to talk about these things. But if I'm in certain rural areas in North Carolina, or 50 years ago, not that it's better now, but in a different context, the price you would have to pay socially could be massive. So playing this role of speaking up is something I've had to analyze in myself and say, man, I'm a pretty shy person sometimes. I do fear, I want people to like me a lot. That's the huge part of me, is trying to be liked, and that's a price that's harder for me to pay. There's been scenarios where later I should have spoke up. I blew it as an ally in that scenario, and I'm going to try to not do that in the future. And say, why wasn't I willing to pay that? Aren't I willing to pay this price?
Well, I think it's the thing about that we opened with is like, this is all a process and it's ongoing. It's, you're never going to fully achieve complete allyship and just stay there. There's going to be moments where it's fluid, right? And so you brought up the idea of how speaking up can be supportive of being an ally and address the Black Lives Matter. And I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on how you might respond when someone says all lives matter in relation to Black Lives Matter, because there is a lot about that going on, controversy right now. Right.
I mean, I start by unfriending them and calling them a racist. No, I'm just kidding. Calling them an idiot. No, this is the part that I'll liken to psychotherapy a little bit, even though I don't do psychotherapy. A lot of the people listening to this talk right now, hopefully a lot of them are therapists. And you're going to be familiar with this idea where there's times you would need your client or your patient to understand something. You don't always just drop truth bombs immediately. You have to know your audience. And so you have to see where they're at, right? With a patient, if you're going to drop a truth bomb on you, you want to know that this is the time, this is the place, this is where they're going to be able to understand this. So you want to know more about why they're doing what they're doing. And in this case, why are you saying all lives matter? I think I have a suspicion of why, but it's white fragility and some other issues. But still, I want to know more about what they mean by that. And I'm trying to gauge where they're at. If it's literally ignorance, that is the easier fix. Because I've got the truth bomb. I can talk about disenfranchisement and how trying to help these people that were underprivileged and being pushed down by society to gain some equity does not mean that you're not saying that all lives don't matter. It's about helping this group right now, right? That's very rational. But a lot of and some of the time that may work, and that would be my answer to what you would say. But unfortunately, with some audiences, that's not going to work. They're not ready for that. It's not the true problem is not, oh, I didn't realize you didn't mean that. It's this emotional defensive reaction.
Right.
So you're going to have to, that's going to be harder to break down someone's really strong defenses. Just like in therapy, you might not just attack right away. You might have to explore some ideas first. So it could come out slower. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. No. I think it's a great point. It is very challenging sometimes to just have people accept the truth bomb. So sometimes it does take time. It does take exploration. And it does take having the discourse. And I think with that, it's important to know how know your audience and how to approach your audience. And I think a lot of people are not always quite clear. So that kind of brings me to one of my next questions, which is, how do you plan on like keeping the discussion going, or, keeping this movement at the forefront of your mind, as opposed to, this just being a trending topic, like I'm an ally, #ally, but actually continuing to do that work. And then on that same note, I'm also wondering if you can kind of speak to, actually, I'm gonna pause and let you answer that question. Like, what are you planning to do? And then I'll have a final question for you.
Cool. Yeah, so keeping it from being just a trending topic in my own mind, it's something that I do not feel like I'm one of the people that is riding the wave of it right now. I'm sure I am in some small way. I'm feeling the ripples of the wave, but I was lucky to have thought about a lot of these ideas a long time ago. Like I said, I grew up in a pretty progressive place. So I went to the same grad school that you went to, and there's a lot of talk about these kinds of issues there. And I'd already reconciled a lot of that. And so when I hear people saying, oh, I've got this idea, did you know that it's saying I want to be colorblind is not actually equal? And I'm like, yeah, I've been, come on. What year is this? You guys, I've been thinking this for forever. How is this a new topic? But you are at risk of forgetting it, right? Even if I'm preaching the converted, even if I'm on that side or I'm woke or all these things, it doesn't mean that I'm doing the best job I possibly can at keeping in the forefront of my mind. I am liable to slip just like any human being. And I'm sure I've had interactions where my privilege went unchecked or my fragility went unnoticed. And so that's sort of an internal thing. I think I do not have the hubris to think I'm at this final stage where I am the ultimate evolved Pokemon of being a Wokemon, of being aware of all these things. That's a good one, by the way. I'm going to
hashtag Wokemon.
Yeah. Copyright. So no, I don't think I'm there at all, but I think the education part of it is less the need for me. For me, it's the reminders part, personally. But for each person is at a different stage. It could be, I need to read more on this thing or this aspect. For me, I sure I need to read more, but mainly I think I need to keep reminding myself about these things. I was like before Black Lives Matter and all this, I was donating to causes like that, especially when Donald Trump got elected, and I went, I'm going to donate to a lot of social causes that seem in danger with the current leadership. So yeah, that's for my journey. It's the reminders. It's putting my money where my mouth is. That's the question about what is allyship and what you're willing to sacrifice. That's the easier one for me to sacrifice. Money price for me to pay, but you pay with your vote, you pay with your money.
Right.
You do pay with your mouth by standing up for people, and you pay with your own psychic pain when you consider your own fragility and weaknesses.
Well, and I think you're with the reminders, I think you're also speaking to the fact that you are open to people approaching you and having this discourse. And, you know, whether you are feeling like you need to go and I'm saying this to the public, like whether you feel like you need to educate yourself through reading, that's one thing. But also having the discussion, ensuring that the person you're speaking to is open to having that discussion and feeling that they're in a place that they can speak to it, I think is what you're talking about. And that there are people out there willing to have the discussion and not being, you know, stuck in the fear that nobody wants to talk about this. No one wants to, it has to happen behind closed doors. I think of Hamilton and, you know, it's been in my house a lot lately. You know, having conversations behind closed doors, you know, let's open the doors and have these conversations in the forefront. As Trevor Noah from The Daily Show says, he wishes he could have brought those discussions from, you know, South Africa to the United States, talking about how racism and inequality have existed, actually helps further the culture, helps further the dialogue. Doesn't fix everything, but I think what you're speaking to is really the work of continuing to do it and needing others to kind of support you in the process through reminders or pointing things out. And that, I think, is absolutely amazing. I have one, actually, I kind of have two questions for you.
We got time.
Yes, we do, which I was looking at. I'm like, yay. So I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the concerns that other white people might have in the medical profession or, you know, in clinical settings when they, you know, find that people of color or Black people in particular are hesitant to engage them, or like they don't want to be seen by a doctor. They don't want you to treat me. They don't, you know, like, how would you explain to them that, you know, this history we have with Tuskegee trials, with polio trials, with bears and other situations that have had very negative impacts? How would you explain to them how this history might inform their reaction?
Just to make sure I understood the question, explaining to the concerned person?
Explaining to the concerned clinician or medical professional who is like, well, why are they just not coming in and taking this treatment?
Right. Yeah, good point. And I'll take this to also answer the unanswered question from earlier you asked about in my role as a neuropsychologist, how this allyship comes up, which I didn't answer before. But that's another way. We're all different. We're all our own person. We can all help in different ways, right? Some people are stronger at speaking up. Some people are using their Facebook to go nuts. I'm not big on Facebook, so that's not how I'm speaking up, because I don't even speak on Facebook anyway. But one thing I do is I'm a neuropsychologist, and so I can put these beliefs into play in some ways. I saw a patient recently who was going for a transplant, had done poorly on a cognitive screening test. They were worried about, therefore, they were worried about his ability to understand the necessary requirements to go through the transplant. You want to know what the risks and benefits are to make an informed decision, but you have all these things you need to follow up with if you get the transplant to make sure that it takes well and that you recover well and so on. Otherwise, they're spending, you know, millions of dollars and valuable resources on someone that it ends up not being good. For example, if you just did a bunch of drugs afterwards and ruined the liver that you just got. Not that this person wouldn't understand that, but this was a African-American gentleman who's, I think he's 70 something, grew up in very, very, very rural areas. He wasn't even sent to school for a long time. I forget how old he was, but way too old to be starting school. and even then was passed through and didn't have very good opportunities there. Obviously, especially in the rural South, especially when he's growing up, the educational opportunities for African Americans was not adequate at all. Not equal is the understatement of the year. And I did think that was playing a large role in his low cognitive test performance. And I gave him a bunch more tests, applied slightly more appropriate norms than some of the tests that just compare him to a bunch of educated white people with different opportunities, and they're going to make him look like his brain doesn't work when his brain works fine. If you explain things in terms that educated white people understand, he might have less access to that vocabulary, less familiarity, or even certain ways of just explaining and understanding things that he just didn't get a chance to develop as easily. Doesn't mean he's not smart. And so I stopped myself from going on a giant rant in the report about the system and all these things that are happening. But I'm trying to say that stop calling this dementia, first of all, with this guy, because his weaknesses were very stable over the course of like 10 years. They were concerned about Alzheimer's, but there's no form of Alzheimer's that goes 10 years without declining at all. And that it had a lot to do with these opportunities and education and things like that. And I was saying, stop calling it that, please. I would not, reject him for the transplant based on cognitive impairment, dementia, because I don't think that explains it. I just think he needs things explained in a different way, and you need to meet him where he's at. But please don't reject him on that basis. And so that was a way that I could apply these ideas to try and help him out. And as far as the medical thing, explaining it to somebody else, it's kind of like the other explanation. I want to see where they're at. Most people in the medical field are going to be a little more educated, and hopefully they're a little more open to being informed about things, even if they've got their own defensiveness and stuff. Hopefully, if you drop truth bombs, they're used to taking in bombs because they've been through medical school or whatever it is. So explaining the context of Tuskegee and this historical problem in the medical field with mistreatment, especially of African Americans, but other groups as well. That's why it's natural for there to be some fear and distrust that is not paranoia when it is justified in a scenario like this. And so we have to do our best to counteract that. Situations like what I tried to do with this, helping this person get this transplant, or what other people can do to try and counteract this unfair system historically.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to answer these really easy questions.
Softball.
Yeah, I mean, this discourse is definitely one that I think hopefully people will go and continue and have with their peers, with colleagues, and actually within a diverse community, so that it's not just, only white people having a discussion, or only Black people, or only Latinos, but having a varied discussion from multiple perspectives. So I do appreciate you for being vulnerable with us and sharing your perspectives and discussing this. Is there anything that you would like our viewership to take away from your discussion?
I think that it's okay to challenge yourself. You will not be destroyed. It's okay to acknowledge inequity. You will not lose everything you have. You will not, we'll actually all gain from it. We have a handout or a resources thing that's going to be available to people. I put a couple things on there, movie, article. I try to mix it up so it's different types of media, so you don't have to just me prescribing you tons of reading. So yeah, keep learning about it. Don't beat yourself up if you're not the Wokemon yet, or your first evolution of Wokemon. The whole point is that you're doing what you can do, and that you're willing and open to try and work on this. That's the key part.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for your time. Really enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm going to bid you adieu and have a wonderful evening as we move on to our next guest.
You too. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. And I do hope that people are getting the opportunity to use the chat to share your thoughts, questions, ideas. And as we move it right along, we're going to be joined by Dr. Helen Hsu, and she is coming to us today after probably her workday as well. She's joined us before and has been in dialogue with us on many different topics. So she's no stranger to the TogetherWell platform. She continues to do great work out of Stanford, and I am really happy to have her join us this evening for our discussion on allyship. And so she should be joining us just shortly. Howdy, how you doing today?
Good. Good to see you again. These months fly by.
They do. Oh, welcome, welcome, welcome. I sound like John Oliver. So thank you so much for making time to be part of this discussion. And I, again, want to just say thank you to all the wonderful work that you are doing. Love the discussion on decolonializing mental health and the work and effort that you're putting in. And so we're coming from a different perspective today. We're going to be talking about allyship. And I'm wondering if you can start there and share with us why you think allyship is even necessary.
Yeah. Thank you for always being such a great facilitator for these really complicated topics. This idea of allyship, fundamentally, it's this idea that nothing, I think, growth or constructive related ever happens without community, right? And so for all of us, it's sort of like there's a necessity piece of any movement or project needs a community and allies and supports. And then there's also just the benefits, right? It's not just like, oh, this is such a horrible necessary thing. It's like there's a real benefit, and I think a joy in doing work that can be extremely draining and painful, to know that sometimes there are people who can help pick up some of this work. And how do we build those networks?
It definitely makes me think of I hate to say African proverb, but I don't think it's been located in a particular region of Africa. But the proverb, you can go faster alone, but you can go farther with a community. And I think that is so true now. The more that we band together, it actually helps us as an entire nation go farther and maybe right some of the wrongs that have happened in the past. And with that, I'm wondering if you feel like there are some alliances or some situations where there are aspects of that allyship that you felt like you gained with your formal education. Did you feel like in school you were able to learn about ways of being an ally, and what they were? And second to that, did you feel like what you learned was enough for what you experienced when you entered the profession?
Yeah. Formal training, no. Right? And we touch upon that when we talk about decolonizing mental health, that we were all educated in an extremely biased system that was never clearly labeled as such. And so it was one way of knowing the world, but it was taught as if like this is the truth. And so there's a lot of figuring out later, like, wow, this doesn't actually work for my clients, or like this doesn't even make sense to me. Some of it was there was some student organizations, things that were going on when I was, say, in graduate school. I started to be introduced to larger organizations like the Asian American Psychological Association. So it's like, oh, here's mentors and other students outside of my immediate campus, and like new perspectives and projects. So in April, several of my esteemed colleagues and I were actually going to present at the counseling psychology conference that has had to be canceled or postponed in New Orleans. But our whole presentation was about how the most rewarding and impactful aspects of our professional careers came from networking and allyship and collegial relationships, none of which was taught to us in school.
Right.
So as a professional now, it's the informal networking, like hopefully we do even now in a remote way. But when I became president of Asian American Psychological Association, it was like the things I got from my own community nationwide. But one of the most impactful was actually getting to work with leaders at the National Latinx Psych Association, the ABPSI, Association of Black Psychologists, Indian Psychologists, Amina Sai, the newest one with Middle Eastern, North African. But it was sort of like, oh, it's not easy sometimes having to communicate across different priorities and states. But it was easier in the sense of like we helped each other amplify one another's voices, share resources, not have to recreate the wheel when we needed to do something, and that we continue in partnership even now.
Well, I think that in that you're describing, how you are working together with others in alliance, and, part of it is actually the communication and the engagement. And I would also say the vulnerability of knowing that you're not always going to get it right. And you might need help. I'm wondering if you could describe maybe an example of how you have demonstrated allyship in your professional work setting.
I really loved, there's a video clip you could easily look up, I think, of Dr. Bettina Love, where she talks about that difference between, she considers allyship kind of a weaker term. And she really says, I'm looking for co-conspirators. Right. Or Dr. Hill at work and we talk about accomplices. And it's like, what is the difference? Right. And actually, Dr. Harris alluded to this. The difference is about actually putting anything on the line. Right. Because it's easier for us all to say, like, I love culture or whatever, in this very superficial way. It's different when there's some kind of action that needs to be taken. So, even a small thing was being asked or invited to be chair of a committee, at a national level. And at first I was like really flattered as a committee member, but then it was like, that particular position really should be held by somebody who has an LGBTQ primary identity, because that was the work. And so not taking that, not taking up that space and really allowing a junior colleague who really should have been holding that space. Or I've talked about when you're doing maybe some of the work right, it starts to get uncomfortable, either realizing things that you haven't done or have done wrong, or taking the brunt of things. So, just the smallest thing I'll tell people is when I really started to, even say several years ago, post about Black Lives Matter, was when I got some of the nastiest responses from people I didn't know. Or when we wore the shirts in Colorado at a Black Lives Matter protest years ago, the looks, and all this, but it was like, wow, this is not pleasant at all, but it's a lot easier than being Black. So we just need more people to sort of tolerate this if they're really going to try and be helping any kind of a community.
Well, and I think that's super important to highlight, is developing the tolerance. And in order to create allyship, it's helping people expand that tolerance more and more until they're in a place where they can be an advocate, and not necessarily an advocate in a way that usurps a voice, but an advocate as a supporter behind a voice. And I think that what you're speaking to is just amazing in the work that you've done and how you're supporting various communities. And I'm wondering if you could speak to how you've witnessed allyship in others, and what was particularly helpful when you saw someone else being that ally.
And there's so many ways to do this, right? And depending on what someone's setting is it that I am citing somebody's work and making a really conscious effort, like to be citing, Black or Indigenous people of color, or recommending them to be on a panel or on a referral, or interrupting a process that is problematic. Some of us may be in positions, if you're in an agency, for example, to be in hiring. right? Where the trainee, and at every level, trainees, staff, executives, like I've sat in hiring positions many times, and it's like, that's a place where everyone at that table really has the ability to have a say in something that influences a lot of people. Right. And are you willing to say the hard things like, gee, you know, are we looking at this candidate in this very narrow way or in this biased way? Or who are you standing up for when there maybe isn't much of an audience, or there's even actually some hostile pushback?
No, it's amazing that some positions don't see how powerful they can be, like being an HR manager, or, you know, there is a lot there. I've often heard people saying, well, we're not getting candidates or applicants from that community. And I have other folks saying that I've applied, but I'm not getting any callbacks. So, and we all know the infamous research available about how applicants with Black sounding names were less likely to get callbacks. So, simple things of just, I don't want to say being blind to names, but being aware of the demographics that you're serving, being aware of the demographic population that you want to increase in your workplace is really important. With that, I'm thinking about how race and ethnicity right now is at the forefront of social and political discourse. And I'm wondering how are there, like, if there are other areas or of a person's identity, such as like traumas and whatnot, that you would also explore allyship with?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about intersectionality and how as therapists, right, we're trying to assess the whole person very quickly. And definitely, right, that what is the person's own, how do they self-identify? Because perhaps the most visible identity is not actually the one that feels most salient to them. So kind of leaving that space, right? And like a key point of, I think, growing in these areas, toward the Pokemon stage, which I love. Somebody needs to draw that.
Yes.
Is constantly knowing like cultural humility and practicing that ourselves, right? So even though I do a lot of trainings and such, I always say, I certainly can't speak for all multicultural people or even all Asian American people. And I've identified, in the last year or so, like, where's my major growth area right now, I feel, is in the area of like really understanding and learning from disability activists, like ableism, that I speak openly about. I think as professionals, we have to be very open in fighting stigma. So I've had given talks where I'm like, who's been, a loved one of someone with mental illness, who has been in treatment. Like, I think we need to be able to say that, but realizing not just mental health stigma, but all ableism, and how right now we're just in this really tough time of, the blatant like abuses toward Black and Brown people and the horrific violence, but then also the like rampant xenophobia against Asian Americans and international members of our community, the targeting of DACA undocumented community members, reduction of LGBT rights, and then the ableism. I've really become aware of how many people I work with are vulnerable,
right,
and sometimes invisibly so, but are being affected by things now in pandemic times. And so really kind of trying to hold all these things. Sometimes they may not have even identified as this. I've worked with, I've worked with cishet white people who are like, I'm realizing I have an identity in a community, maybe in the disabled community or first gen low income. And I've never thought about myself that way.
Well, I think it speaks to the importance of taking the time and thinking about the self and who you truly identify with or identify as. Because I don't think we take a lot of time to reflect on who we are. And I say we because I think that whether you are a patient, a mental health professional, a medical professional, any person, especially in this Western society, we're always pushed to go, 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 do, and that self-reflection is sometimes lacking. And I think the more that we're able to do it, and unfortunately COVID has kind of forced people to do it a little prematurely, some people are ready to embrace it, others are totally terrified. And I think that what you're speaking to is, if you're being an ally, you are helping to provide a voice for those who may not feel like they can verbalize that they need support, and being with them in such a vulnerable time. I think that is amazing work. And I'm just thinking about that too, for those who come to therapy, and if they're a person of color and encountering a white therapist, what might white therapists be able to do to use their position of privilege to support, Black, Indigenous people of color, or, LGBTQ community as well.
I do think that, in these times, there are a lot. I'm on some therapists like social media groups, and there are some people like, say cishet white therapists, like, how am I supposed to do this, and feeling very worried, like I'm going to do it wrong, and I'm being made aware of like harm and complaints, which is always difficult to take. But the research does not show that you have to have therapists matching. Right. Like, very often we know people maybe prefer someone who shares an identity, and it makes just things easier, but it's not absolutely necessary. So on that piece, I think knowing that you can be culturally responsive and growth oriented and helpful to a person doesn't require matching. But how do you do it, right? Like, being cognizant of like your own assumptions, not putting the labor on the client, and even your colleagues, right? Like, do you make the time to have your resources and consults and have that be a mutual, or do you suddenly run up in a situation and you grab someone and expect them to give you their emotional labor or intellectual labor? So really investing. And it can be powerful because, just because somebody has a certain identity doesn't mean they're somewhere, as you said earlier, there's an identity development scale. So I've often talked about, I remember there was, an Asian American young man, a college student, who had a lot of internalized colonial ideas and negative feelings about the way his parents, who were immigrants, raised him. And it was very Western biased and detriment based. And actually, it was his white male therapist who really helped him to see that in their own way, his parents showed their love culturally very different. And that was very validating for him to actually have a white person who could see and value that, and they explored this together.
Yeah, I think that is a powerful experience of, especially how, a white therapist isn't necessarily taking the position that, parenting has to look this way. And, it's sometimes a lot harder to step out of that, especially when there's been, particular history around how a culture has been looked at in terms of their behaviors. So hearing that, I think, is really a hopeful experience for people being able to have these dialogues and being able to see clinicians that don't necessarily look like them, and really supporting bridging that that difference. And you've talked about how allies are working and supporting lots of different communities, and I'm wondering how allies can confront and combat the, I don't know, I didn't want to say anything because I was afraid it's going to come out wrong, or, just kind of that mentality of thinking that they're going to make a mistake, so they have to be quiet.
I think just really being in that moment, I think as therapists, right, using that skill for ourselves, right? Sometimes there's something going on in the room that could be from a client, could be from you. Right. And you're not sure what it is, but sometimes, right, we just make that process comment. Like, like, I'm uncomfortable with this and I'm not sure, like, if that's something, what should we do with that? Right. Because maybe what we should do with that is that this client is happy to talk to you about their culture or their experience, or maybe they're like, I don't really want to educate you and this isn't the space, so you're never going to know exactly, but kind of being in the process and really sitting with that, and knowing, I think now, especially from the Black community, you know, in recent months, they've really said, you know, how many thousands of times, like, silence is complicity. And so silently going along with things is hurtful, and enables a hurtful system. And getting a private text or message later, like, oh, wow, that was kind of messed up, or I felt bad for you, isn't helpful.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So we recently had a situation where somebody who was extremely powerful was completely neglecting to address anything about Black Lives Matter. And this was kind of at the height of all the pain and the unrest. And, you know, a very not high in the hierarchy Black person was in the comments like, you know, can I say something?
Yeah.
You know, and then it was a white ally who then was like, waited, and then was like, you know, I want to hear what she has to say, because it wasn't stopping, you know. Right. So even that, it's such a small thing, but it was like, that's the kind of thing that often we don't do, or we haven't done.
Yeah. Well, I think also stepping outside the belief that somebody else is going to speak or do it. I can't think of the term, not social loafing, but
the bystander effect.
Thank you. It's like sometimes, you know, that basic psychology just does not come to my brain. But yes, like, not waiting for someone else to step up and make the comment, and knowing that if you don't make it a perfect statement, that's okay, because we're not in the field of perfection.
Right.
We're in the field of being human. And so I appreciate you sharing that, you know, helping people to recognize that you just do have to speak. And I'm just wondering too, just from your personal experience, what is it like for you being a therapist, being a clinician right now? And can you think of any successes or challenges that have been unique for you in this moment?
I think for all of us right now doing therapy in this moment, besides the fact that we live on telehealth, is we're clearly in something with all our clients that is not usually the case, right? We're usually a little bit more of a blank, but we're in it now. And then clearly also, as an identifiable minority, we're living in an age of like racism and xenophobia. So it's been interesting sort of flexing with sort of the self-disclosure level with my clients, and pacing sort of how do we as colleagues work in allyship, because there's just so much going on. And so pacing that, I think that's been a learning experience, but it's been very positive, sort of like as a work community and a professional community. There have been like joint efforts about how do we get resources here? How do we make a statement in support of this? My colleague is going to help me do this thing about Asian American xenophobia, and then now we're going to do this for a Black Lives Vigil, and now we're going to do this section on ableism. It's an exhausting time, but I feel very fortunate to have sort of found some professional and personal communities where it's like, okay, how are we going to help each other get through this?
Yeah, I totally echo that this is a very, very exhausting time. But there is so much rich work that is taking place, and I am very hopeful that it is going to continue post-COVID in a very positive direction, post-Trump administration as well, continuing to see this momentum of change. And I'm just wondering, you know, in the time that we have left, if you don't mind sharing with us what you feel are some of the do's and don'ts of allyship. What might you say are some things that you should do or shouldn't do if you're an ally?
I think two very simple things is, right, the slogan, like nothing about us without us. That comes up a lot in mental health work, right? That if you're making policies and things without including people who are in treatment and their caretakers, that is often very hurtful rather than helpful. And that's the same for every community, you know. So are people really at the table, and do you value them? Because that was another thing I remember at the county at one point would say, yes, we do want your clients. And I was at a primarily Asian American agency for very low income, very stressed communities. And the county would say, we do value your opinion. Please send people to these meetings. And I'm like, are you going to pay them? Because their lived wisdom and their experience, that's valuable, you know? Right. And if you say you value them, treat them like they're valued.
Right.
So nothing about us without us, and treat people like they're valuable, right? There's a lot of Black, Indigenous people of color right now being asked to do free work. And that is just recreating the very system that has contributed to where we're at in terms of exploiting people's labor and time. And then just something I've tried to practice and remind myself and have told people is like, you know, if you're really an ally, you don't hog the mic. You know, say what you need to say, push and promote who should be there. And especially, and I'm a huge, you know, I dedicate a lot of my free time to mentoring and supervision, bring up the new people, the new voices, and then just like get out of the way.
Right. I also just think that how nice it is to have allies, because you are passing the torch. So you get to see the growth. You get to see people take things in directions that maybe you didn't think of, and you helped mold that. So I wholeheartedly appreciate that. And just those points of really making sure to be inclusive and not exclusive, and really supporting this idea of having discourse and support for, you know, our communities of color.
Yes.
So
it's a work in progress, you know.
And that is the work. I think it's so important to remind everyone, like, perfection is not what we're striving for. It's progress, and there's always going to be new things to learn and different things to do. And while some might find that exhausting, you know, actually it's all exhausting to some degree. Some might feel like, I don't want to do that because there's no mastery in it. I think that attitude is it's disabling. It keeps you from moving forward. I think it's so awesome to have new ideas and to continue to have rich, you know, discourse about challenging and easy topics. So, you know, with that, I want to thank you for joining us and sharing your wisdom. And we always love to have you. And I'm just wondering, is there one takeaway that you'd like our viewers to have from our discussion?
Yeah, no, keep showing up. I thank everyone for being here on an evening. Yeah, lifelong learning is really the key to like cultural responsiveness and humility. And although it's hard, I think it's incredibly rewarding.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And have a wonderful evening. And we'll be wrapping up with Dr. Helen Hsu.
Looking forward to it.
Have a good one. So thank you all again for joining us. And we're going to be jumping into our final discussion with Dr. Natalie Jones. She has a rich history of doing a lot of work in this arena, and I think she has so much wonderful experience to share with us, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Natalie Jones this evening, who will be joining us for our discussion. And with that, I will take a sip of water. In the meantime, until she's ready to join us, I am wondering if folks are using the chat and taking the polls. Please do so if you haven't. Share your thoughts, share your comments. I think there is a lot of wonderful opportunity to engage in a dialogue with some of our peers through the chat, and to get some different perspectives. So please definitely take the time to use that. And it looks like we are being joined now by Dr. Jones, who will be popping up shortly.
Yes. Give me one moment. I'm having some technical difficulties with the camera here. I may have to leave and come back. this system is a little new for me, so I'm very
Not a problem. Thank you, and thank you all for being patient as we figure out some of our technical issues, and maybe we've got it figured out.
You know, it seems to, I don't know why.
Take your time. There we go. But now we don't have sound. No. This is what happens in COVID life. Zoom and all of that. Not yet. And she's going to try it one more time and see if we can get her joining us. There we go. Third time's a charm. Right?
Okay, I hope me. Can you hear
Yes.
me? Okay, good. Okay.
I can hear the words coming out of your mouth.
Okay, great. All right. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Absolutely.
And we really appreciate you taking the time. So you've had an opportunity to hear Dr. Harris and Dr. Hsu, and now we're going to be jumping in with you.
Absolutely.
And first, let me give you an opportunity to give you a proper introduction. I apologize, I did not give you a proper introduction. So tell us a little bit about you and where you're coming to us from.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. No problem. So I'm in Oakland, California. I'm a psychotherapist, and I specialize in a couple of different things. I specialize in African American women's mental health. I specialize in treating professional African American women who are in the process of healing from narcissistic abuse. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I do forensic work where I actually work with perpetrators of violence. And so I have a podcast, a Date with Darkness podcast that kind of, wraps all that up and talks about education and healing and stuff from narcissistic abuse as well. So I do the podcasting, I write, blog and write for other people as well. So just a variety of different things.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I imagine that you often find that the current political climate is coming up in your work. And I'm wondering for you, with race and ethnicity being in, pretty much at the forefront right now, how does a person's identity, whether it's trauma or their experience, kind of play a role with allyship? How do you help them to navigate that?
With respect to African American people or Black people, there is a lot of controversy around allyship, right? Because a lot of the people that I work with, they feel like it's not their responsibility to teach people how to be an ally, right? They feel like it's not their responsibility to teach people about what their trauma is or how to be racially or culturally sensitive. And on the one hand, I can see where people are coming from. A lot of people feel like, why is this such a mystery? It's something that we've been fighting for years. And some of these questions that we're being asked about the racial climate are just ignorant, or they're insensitive. Or why can't people just Google it and find out if they really are passionate about it? Why can't they, make the extra effort to go and research African-American literature, look up on, just kind of look up stuff on their own or research, or even get out into the community and really see what's going on instead of staying in the comfort of your own home and turning to your neighbor and asking them to give them all the answers. So there's a lot of anger around that. There's a lot of feeling cheated, because it's like, if you really wanted to know about me and what I'm going through or what we're going through collectively as a community, there would be more effort to do that. As opposed to kind of just throwing your hands in the air and saying, what am I supposed to do? Like, you would be passionate. And a lot of people feel cheated because when it comes to other things, political hot topics, just other things in general, sexuality, or just saving the whales or whatever, people just kind of jump in, and it's like there's no questions asked. There's a passion, there's all this collectivist attitudes about people that want to fight, and they want to save, they want to change. They're gonna do what it needs to be done to make those changes, and they're gonna do it right then and there. There's a lot of like passion behind that, and what they're feeling angry about is they don't feel the same passion. It's more like, well, what are we supposed to do?
Right. I think it's a very strong point, and I appreciate you bringing that to the forefront, because as we're talking about allyship, there is an initial desire for, I think, a lot of people, not necessarily people of color, but to go to their Black counterparts or African American counterparts and say, what should I do? But in terms of thinking about developing an ally mind, I appreciate you stating that there's a desire for people to do the extra step and to educate themselves. I'm also wondering if you might be able to speak to the idea of kind of how we talked about with Helen, where there is kind of a disconnect between what you might read versus the experience. So what might you suggest for an ally who has done some readings or educating themselves in one manner, but don't necessarily have the experience of being an ally?
Get in there. Get in the trenches and do it. Long before I started my career in psychology and mental health, I did a lot of community service work. Every summer, my mom made me go out and work as a volunteer. So I did a lot of stuff with like the Humane Society and other organizations, where I got to see real world experiences. I got to see how people treated other specimens, other people, things of that nature. And that was something that I did well into my college years. And I do think that there's a richness that comes from being actively involved in the community, traveling, immersing yourself in other cultures, allowing yourself to be surrounded in a community, but also working in that community, and just really kind of getting into understanding deeply what that community is. But also too, I think what is really burning up a lot of people right now, and why people are feeling so angry, rightfully so, is what you see in the workplace, what you see when people are trying to get housing, when people are trying to get loans and stuff like that, and they're being turned down for opportunities. So if you're a person that considers yourself to be an ally, but you work in a place where you work with, maybe very few people of color, or maybe there are additional people of color, or like a plentiful of people of color, but you see the microaggressions, the micro assaults, just the underhanded things, the denial of opportunities. And if you're quiet, or you pretend like you don't see it, or you take advantage of the opportunity when you know that there's other people that have worked equally as hard as you or more hard than you, and you consider yourself to be an ally and you don't say anything, then you are part of the systemic problem. And so go ahead.
I think it sounds, I think that's all really important. And it sounds like you're answering a couple of my questions in terms of what hurts allyship. And it sounds like not speaking up, taking advantage of privileges, and not being mindful of your position in relation to your role as an ally. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little more to what an advocate for Black lives should be doing versus what they shouldn't be doing.
There's a lot of things that you can be doing and you shouldn't be doing. I think a lot of people want to help, but they don't necessarily want to get their hands dirty. You know, and what I mean by that is like similar to maybe someone who might want to work with a homeless population or work with like abused animals. Like they want to help, but they don't necessarily want to like go to the source of the problem. So what they'll do is they'll throw money at the problem. So they'll throw money at some sort of organization and say, here, we're all about Black Lives Matter now because we've given money to these organizations, so we stand in unity with Black people. The other thing that I'm seeing a lot of is marketing for Black Lives Matter from storefronts and businesses saying that we're all about businesses. Well, Black Lives Matter. Well, that's just business. There's no real, like, there's nothing behind it. And for me, like, it needs to be a layered approach. Even if you are a business that wants to stand with it, what is your CEO, your chairpersons, what are those people in top leadership look like?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do the people in leadership look like? What steps has your organization taken to appreciate diversity? Like, are you making it a point to have racial diversity training? Or is it like, you know, behind the scenes, you're in front of everybody, you're saying one thing, but behind the scenes, you're still oppressing people.
So walking your walk and talking your talk. Like, don't just, you know, say you're going to do it, like actually do it.
Absolutely.
I would add to that point, not just having a diversity and inclusion officer.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
really,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even in our profession, you know, when you study, like, you know, you go to school, you study for the EPPP, there's next to no Black psychologists that were researching. Honestly, a lot of it still revolves around older white men, Freud, Piaget, you know, all those people. Like, the field of psychology is still revolving a lot around that stereotypical white guy. And I can't believe that there hasn't been someone in all these years that has come up with some fresh stuff that is more applicable to the modern day person, that is applicable to people of color. Why aren't there more people of color in psychology textbooks? Why aren't there more African Americans, psychologists on Psychology Today writing about mental health? Why is a white woman telling me about African American families on Psychology Today? So there's a lot of that, even within our field, that's very oppressive, that's kind of overlooked, and we really haven't taken a stance. And psychology is behind a lot of warfare.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion that I think we should eventually get into, but I do hear that. And I think, to your point, my concern is that in our history, what has happened is that there becomes a segregation in resources. So if you want to learn about Black lives, you only go to, you know, the Black section or of this article, and this is where they're talking about Black lives. This is where they're talking about Asian lives and Asian culture. This is where they're talking about Middle Eastern lives. And I think that exclusivity doesn't create space for the dialogue that's necessary for there to be an inclusion. And I really do appreciate you pointing that out, is that sometimes there is a discrepancy.
Yes.
Sometimes it's not 100% unheard of where this white woman might have an experience that relates to Black lives. But when that's 100% the experience, it's a challenge. So you know, so in many ways, as you've kind of talked about all these different experiences, I'm wondering if you could speak to, you know, some of these controversial situations that are happening in our society right now. Like, how do you see your role with clients who come in and say things like all lives matter versus, or blue lives matter in relation to Black lives matter?
You know, that's a tricky one, because I haven't had a lot of people say that to me, but there have been a couple of conversations where that has happened. And it's been very uncomfortable because for me, like, here we go, like having to explain, like, that's kind of like being ignorant to a certain extent, because yes, all lives matter on, I don't know what the right word is. On some level, that is true, but all lives aren't being lost due to law enforcement. All lives aren't being lost due to racism right here and now. So you have people that are losing their lives. You have people not only that are losing their lives, but they're losing their livelihood. Their culture, our culture, Black lives culture is being stripped from them and being handed over to someone else, who's not Black, and they're being celebrated for it. So it's like we're the only culture that gets shamed, one of the only culture that gets shamed for a lot of what we're doing, from the way we dress to figure to colorism. Whereas if you can turn it over to a non-African American community, they can get highlighted for it. So while all lives matter, our lives are being seriously oppressed. And so I don't really get into that whole, that argument with someone, because I do feel like those things can elevate very quickly, because someone who says that, when they come in and they say that, they're not willing to be open-minded. They've already kind of made up their mind. And I feel like that's a point of contention or hostility. It's like, oh, that's kind of like that old boy mentality where it's just like, oh, well, all lives matter. That's very dismissive.
Well, and Dr. Harris also made that same point. Like, maybe it really depends on where this person is in their own identity development and whether they're ready to take in an alternative perspective. And we all have our defenses, but I think when people are defending, a position at this time in this climate, I think a lot of people are not sure how to respond, or they take up a position and this is where I stand and that's it. There's nothing more. And that perpetuates the same issues of racism. And I love that you spoke to racism and racial inequity and the disparity in terms of cultural issues in mental health, because I really would love to have your input on whether you feel racism is a mental health issue. And as a therapist, it's our job to address these issues and bring them into the room. That's my opinion. But I'm also wondering, do you feel that it would be your job to bring these issues into the room? So that's a two-parter in terms of my question.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. That's an interesting question. I've heard a couple of people say that racism is a mental health issue, and I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that, because I think that is something that you have to be intentional about. It comes from, sometimes it can come from rearing, so it can come from nurture, but also it can come from nature. But also, too, that's a choice. That is a choice that you could make, whether or not that's something that you want to continue to do. Discrimination, stereotyping is a choice. Can people go down the rabbit hole and kind of stay stuck in that? Absolutely. But do I think that it's a mental health issue where, they need help per se, or they need a professional to kind of get them out of it? No, absolutely not. I think it is a choice, and I think that people can choose to either do it or not do it. You can make choices to surround yourself with certain people. You can make that extra effort to be in those communities and have those conversations. And you can make the choice to say, you know what, I'm not, I might have had a racist mother or a racist grandfather, but that's not who I choose to be.
So I appreciate your position on that, because I think that there's a lot of diverse thought and even some, challenges in the community around this. And I'm wondering if you feel that it sounds like, and totally tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're saying racism is not diagnostic.
It is not diagnostic, it's narcissistic. And that is not a mental health issue, that is a characterological issue. When you take the time to take power over other people and oppress other people, limit the information intentionally, block them from opportunities, it is oppressive and it is a characterological defect. It is not a mental health issue. And I don't agree with, putting an oppressor in a box to have sympathy, be sympathized for, by saying that they have a mental illness. It's not a mental illness, not for me. No.
Well, I think that's a really important point, and I would imagine that it gets highlighted in your work working with perpetrators and aggressors, where a lot of times, and even in the beginning of the discussion, where people of color are asked to have this discussion or educate or be a voice to help shift the thinking, that it does create a lot of challenges for us, because we've been doing it. We've already done it. We can go back, gosh, I mean, now of course I can't think of the name of the song, but What's Going On was written in, and we're still writing the same narratives. So I totally appreciate you bringing that point too. And I think that, I've not heard it from the perspective of thinking about racism as narcissism, and it's definitely given me food for thought. And I do hope that people are thinking about that too, and speaking to that. With that, with kind of dealing with racial ideas, racism, racists, narcissists, however we're going to use which perspective we're using, I'm wondering what you think actually promotes change, and what would help people to begin to counter these racist ideas and tendencies.
I think it's kind of what we've been fighting for, which is equality. So my thing is, I think, again, it's a systemic issue. And when you start taking away funding and opportunities, when we as a community are adamant about making efforts to correct bad behavior on every single level, that will promote change. And don't get me wrong, we all can have our opinions, right? We can all have our opinions. We can all have a preference. We can all not like something or someone. We may not even like a specific feature, and you are entitled to your opinion. However, when it comes to the point where people's lives are at stake, job opportunities are, kind of lost, housing, all these other resources are lost upon a particular community, then that's where we need to start. We need to start making more information public so people can actually see the numbers and see what's going on, and really start maybe even attacking funding in specific areas where these things are going on. There's a lot of discrepancies. There's a lot of hiding behind smoke and mirrors, but really getting into organizations and systems that discriminate, and having more people of color in there to kind of evaluate those things. And I feel like that's a very detailed question, and I could really go on about it, but I feel like you have to strike, you have to cut the snake off at the head, basically. So I feel like once you cut off the top, everything else will be a trickle down effect. So you don't need people in leadership, head of countries that are promoting these things like that. Once you have that, you need to get those kind of people out of there. And you need to get people in there that are really for equality, and that are not just discriminating on superficial things such as skin color.
So where do you think we may have gone wrong? And, because we know that research doesn't necessarily, people who are aware doesn't necessarily promote change. And coming from an administration that had a Black president to where we are now, I'm wondering where we went wrong. What should we have continued to foster and support to help people overcome these racist tendencies or, ideas that haven't been supporting growth?
I think it goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of our conversations, is early education. It's knowledge in the classroom. When you open up history books, what do you see? What are children being taught? They're only being taught one aspect of history. They're only being taught one aspect of science. They're only being taught one aspect of psychology. And most, if 99% of the people that are being looked at as being great thought-provoking leaders in all of those areas, mathematicians, all of those areas, are non-Black people, are non-Hispanic people. So we need to diversify the education, start from the beginning. We also need to, incorporate that into the workplace, and it needs to be a requirement. It needs to be an ongoing, regular requirement. Behavior needs to be supervised. Good behavior that's non-racist, non-stereotypical, it needs to be supervised, and it needs to be, one of those things where it's addressed. To start having these conversations, they need to start getting comfortable with having these conversations.
No, I think that is absolutely amazing. And I think that if we can begin that process, and I think that this movement has really kind of propelled this kind of thought into the forefront of making the shifts from what is in or what has been in our history books to what should be in our history books. I'm also thinking about, currently, what do we do to support our Black colleagues who are clinicians and in the field right now? And who are patients, right? So what would you recommend as things that should be said or things that shouldn't be said to our Black patients or our Black colleagues?
How can I support you? How are you feeling about everything? What does this bring up for you? Does this bring up anything for you? Are you having discussions at home about this? Is this something that you feel safe talking with someone about? Like, are you opening up dialogues and, what do you think about everything that's going on? Just sort of having that dialogue and making sure that person feels safe with you. And a lot of times you find that, you might not agree on everything, but there's some commonality. And I think as African-American, Black professionals, we want to feel like someone's got our back. Especially when you're a psychologist such as yourself, you walk into a room and you're the only Black person there. We know there's an innate feeling that it's them against us, but you want to be talking with another Black professional because you want to feel that support that only and you feel safe sharing because they're going to get it and they're going to have your back. And I feel like that's what people want in times of extreme duress, like what we're in now in the middle of this virus, in the middle of the protests. You want to feel like, oh God, am I safe? Is it safe to kind of let my hair down? And is this person going to really have my back? And I think that's the most comforting feeling, where it's like, oh, I don't have to fight anymore, or I don't have to put on airs when I talk to this person, because I know that this person really gets me. Even if we don't agree on everything, I feel like this person has my back.
Well, I think that, of course, it's an experience that I'm all too familiar with in terms of going into a room and not being surrounded by others that look like me. But I also imagine that for many in this time, there's a desire to speak up and point that out. It's like, I'm recognizing that more. And I imagine that if people aren't feeling that, if they we'll now start to embrace that, conversation. Let's point these things out so that we can have this dialogue that can make those shifts towards a community where there are people that maybe look like me. I'm wondering in the time we have, one of my final questions for you is just, what's it like for you being a therapist right now? And if you can speak to your own experience about how you may have experienced microaggressions or, just slights as being a clinician at this time, a clinician of color at this time.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Working in the field of psychology, period. It's always been an interesting, when you have an upper degree, you have those people that kind of refuse to call you doctor, or that refuse to acknowledge you as a professional. And then when you're working with the multidisciplinary treatment team, it's interesting to see that it's interesting to see that other professionals kind of do the same thing, if not worse. So again, some of those back-ended comments like all lives matter, blue lives matter, that kind of stuff like that. So there is that whole piece. But I think, just very quickly, what I will say is that it is very challenging to kind of balance that as a professional, as a supporter, as a healer, if you will, of sorts, to kind of do all of those things and then manage the other microaggressions. So and I work in a criminal justice setting. So to watch the lack of diversity in staff, or to watch to see the lack of diversity in leadership, and there's this underlying, almost kind of like this underlying theme that, because you're Black, they're probably not going to put people in that position just simply because of that. It doesn't matter how good you are, it's kind of those kind of underlying themes that you kind of see. It's not really spoken about, but everybody kind of knows it. It's not spoken about openly, but everybody kind of talks about it behind the curtain, and it's kind of that commonality. So just lots of self-care around that, and lots of processing that on my own with people that I do trust, and I do have non-Black allies that I also talk with, and I show them and tell them how to support me when they don't know.
I think that is a really important thing of being able to say, hey, this is how I need you to support me right now.
Yeah.
And people being willing to listen, to be able to say, I don't know it all. I don't know what you need, but I'm willing to learn.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you taking the time to spend time with us. You've given me a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure you've given a lot of our viewership a lot of food for thought. And really enjoyed your perspectives. I'm wondering if there's anything that you would like to have as a takeaway that you want to share from our discussion.
I think the top takeaway is continue to be an advocate. Don't let the passion die out. People need to continue to advocate, and we need to do more than just conversate about this. We need to really kind of just keep the passion going, and collectively as a community, there's always strength in numbers. There's always, there's allyship in ways, and sometimes allies don't know all the ways to support you. And that doesn't mean that you need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sometimes you do have to show people how to support you and what works for you. So I definitely say keep fighting the fight. And there's many ways you can be an ally, even within the Black Lives Matter movement. If you're passionate about that, don't try to do everything. Pick one aspect of a movement that you're really passionate about and that you can focus your energy on and go with that. If you're able to pick two, then go with that. But I would say don't overwhelm yourself. Pick something that you're really passionate about and focus on that and put a lot of energy into that. And support Black therapists. My friend and colleague, Dr. Joy Hard Bradford, has therapyforblackgirls.com. So, Black therapists always need a little love. So I would definitely recommend that. Just supporting therapists of color, putting therapists of color in events like this.
Well, and yes, also the therapist you referenced has a really lovely video log. So it's just, awesome to be able to have that resource and just listen, just to listen. Yeah. So I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening in our discussion about becoming a stronger ally. Please definitely be sure to access the resources that have been put into our chat, and to also just to keep our conversation going. Maybe talking with colleagues in your circles about how to become a better and stronger ally. Just a couple of housekeeping things. I'll do the housekeeping things and then I'll do my summary. So just a few housekeeping things. Please definitely look for our upcoming event in August, where it's going to be geared more towards our early career psychologists and our graduate students. But definitely see the link in the chat to join us for that event. I think it's going to be fantastic in terms of looking at microaggressions and experiences of those who are in graduate school or ECP. After our full-on event, there will be the meditation. As always, please definitely take a moment to join that. We had some very charged discussions, and I do hope that each person was able to reflect on how they felt during different parts of the conversation, and if maybe those parts of the conversation that were more challenging, they were able to grapple with and come out on a different perspective, which would facilitate that growth. So we are always looking to be a support for that. Also, if you are interested in learning more about TogetherWell, definitely visit the TogetherWell.org site. And again, it's a great organization that helps facilitate speakers to get connected with different organizations to support them. And I want to make sure that I totally thank our speakers for participating and making themselves available to be vulnerable. Thank you, Dr. Matt Harris. Thank you, Dr. Helen Hsu. And thank you, Dr. Natalie Jones. You have been instrumental in providing thoughts and perspectives that really, really help shift, I think, this dialogue and just this topic in a very positive direction. I appreciate your vulnerability and your willingness to let me ask you all these questions. And I thank you to the attendees for making space to come in your long day or late evenings to participate in this event. If you are wanting to access the resource guides, definitely please access it in the chat. You will be able to access our videos via YouTube shortly after the events. On YouTube are our other previous events if you want to take a look at those. And I would also like to give a thank you shout out to the Pollination Project for supporting the event, and to the PAD for offering the attendees a free month of virtual yoga and Pilates. Definitely take them up on that offer. It is great to get moving. So definitely see the chat for the promo code if you are interested. And as always, thank you so much to Dr. Michele Haley, who opened up this event, and for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. With that, I bid you all adieu. Have a wonderful night, and thank you so much. Take care.